Abby is currently responsible for the Georgia Bight Shorebirds initiative. She'll tell you all about the Georgia Bight in a minute. I think, you know, a lot of you know Abby. Abby has a nice connection to Hilton Head Audubon, and that you know, Manomet is the sponsor of the International Shorebird Survey, which we do along Port Royal Sound every month. And, you know, we've been proud to be part of that effort through Carol Clemens and Fran Baer and others for many, many years. Abby recently earned her doctorate at the University of Georgia. And prior to working on her degree, she was at Little St. Simon's Island for a number of years. And any of you who've been to Little St. Simon's know what a gem it is. So before moving south, Abby grew up in Western New York and attended the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry for her BS in environmental biology. So, you know, with that as an intro, I'd like to welcome Abby, and we'll take it from there. Abby.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for zooming on in to hear about shorebirds. I will say also, as you're talking about some of the cool birds that y'all are seeing in Georgia, we've had a bit of a exciting buff-breasted sandpipers coming through. And so on several of the different barrier islands, people have been reporting buffies, which is pretty rare for us. And I still haven't gotten to the spots where they've been seen, but it's worth keeping your eyes out. I don't know if you've got any spots where there's kind of like back beach and that Salicornia, purslane type overwash area. But if you're out on the beach, take a close look in those places, because that has been just a bit of a magnet for buffies this fall, which is really exciting. So anyways, I'll get started here. And again, just thank you all so much for joining. Wish I could be there in person with you. I've talked to many of you at different points, and was very much looking forward to getting to see y'all in person, but this works almost as well. And so today I'm going to be kind of sharing some of the stories of the shorebirds that are using our Georgia Bight, and helping you know, draw some connections between where we are here locally and the larger hemisphere that these shorebirds are using. And so if you have questions at any point, I'm not sure if I'll see them, but I'll try and sort of keep an eye on the chat too, but happy to try to answer questions as they come up as we go through this. So if I can advance this slide. First of all, the main goal of this talk is that shorebirds are incredible. So hopefully you all feel that already. I certainly do. I'm going to be highlighting some of these incredible stories from a couple of different perspectives. So we're going to talk really briefly about beach nesting shorebirds here in the Southeast, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Arctic nesting shorebirds as well, because we're just wrapping up the summer season, and it's worth talking a little bit about nesting birds. And a lot of the fall migrants that we're seeing are actually juvenile birds coming down. So it's kind of nice to take a step back in time a little bit and think about what just happened in the life of the shorebird in terms of nesting season. And then we're going to talk a bit about migration, and then finally sort of connect it all through the story of a whimbrel. And so in this way, we're kind of going from the local scale to the big picture, hemisphere-wide scale, thinking about shorebirds. And then wrap things up with a little bit of talking about some of the big threats that shorebirds encounter and some of the tools that we have at Manomet, and more broadly to address some of those threats. And I can't take credit for this incredible picture. Brad Wynn, my supervisor at Manomet, who many of you may know from his time down in Georgia, took this one, and I think it's pretty darn impressive. You see the diversity of shorebirds. He got this picture in Georgia, and it's just if you all want to play Guess the Shorebird, this is a fun one. You've got long-billed curlews and willets and oyster catchers and dowitchers and godwits, and really a pretty incredibly diverse flock of shorebirds right there. And so this is kind of a celebration of what's in our backyard. I know as an Audubon group, everyone knows what a shorebird is, but I always like to throw this in because you never know who might be sitting there wondering what exactly makes up a shorebird. Generally, we're talking about shorebirds. We're talking about birds with long bills and long legs, and they're feeding in kind of wet, muddy areas where the land meets the water. And they're eating invertebrates and insects and all sorts of different food that they often get by probing down in wet mud or sand with their bills. And thinking about their bills, one of the things that makes shorebirds so incredible is this huge diversity of bill lengths and shapes and sizes. And because they have these specialized bills, they're able to access a lot of different food resources. So, you know, you can see that one picture of that tight little group of sandpipers eating at horseshoe crab eggs. With all the different length bills, they're able to access different depths of the sand. And so they're not really in competition with one another. They're able to sort of just get at slightly different levels of the sand with those differently length bills. And then you've got birds like the Wilson's plover down there eating a fiddler crab. It's got a big chunky bill compared to any other plover, and that's because you need some serious tools to catch fiddler crabs. Whimbrel, like the one in the middle here with a decurved bill, can drive that long curved bill right down into fiddler crab burrows and pull them up. You see avocets skimming at the top of the water or sometimes down in the mud with their upturned bill. And then oyster catchers, of course, everyone's favorite, I think. This really neat bill that looks just like a shucking knife that they use to pop open oysters and other bivalves. The other neat adaptation that many shorebirds have is that they are super cryptic, right? Their plumage and their eggs blend in really well with their surroundings. And so you can see the shorebird blending in really well here in this picture. And that is a picture I took in the Arctic, actually, so it's not really fair. It is right there. And it's a pectoral sandpiper on the breeding grounds up near Barrow. So blending in really well. And then, of course, the eggs and the chicks blend in really well with their surroundings, too. And that's one of their best strategies for defense against predators. Many of these photos are Wilson's plovers. I don't know if y'all can see my cursor on the screen. Maybe. Wilson's plover nests, an American oyster catcher nest, and both the chicks and the eggs blend in really well. This is a golden plover nest down here in the lower left, and that's up in the Arctic. So you can see even up in the Arctic, the eggs and the chicks blend in well with their surroundings. And here, just an example of a Wilson's plover chick blending in so well on the back part of the beach on Little St. Simons. Zoomed in, he's got his head down and he's tucked right in the sand, and you can actually barely see him from a distance. So I just got done telling you that shorebirds are hard to see, but I think one of the greatest things about shorebirds for anybody that's learning shorebirds and diving into this world, you actually can see them pretty easily, especially when you compare them to pesky warblers. So you've got a spotting scope, you're standing out on the open sand, there's not a lot of obstructions. It gives you plenty of time to sit there and stare at them and try to identify a western sandpiper versus the semi-palmated sandpiper. So that's just a bit of background about why shorebirds are so incredible. Now we're going to talk about how incredible the place that we get to live is in the Georgia Bight. And so kind of setting the stage for understanding what makes this landscape so important for shorebirds. And the Georgia Bight is really dominated by these undeveloped, natural, intact barrier islands and beach systems like this, where we get to really get a firsthand look at how these places are actually habitat for a lot of critical wildlife species. And there's some pretty neat reasons, and I always recycle this figure because I think it's the very coolest. And so if you've heard me talk before, I apologize if you're seeing this more than once, but I love it. So this kind of explains in a nutshell why our coast looks the way that it does. And so we are here in the Georgia Bight, and the Bight is that curved part of the coastline that stretches from Cape Hatteras down to Cape Canaveral. And the work that I do focuses really on the northeast Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina part of the Bight. And that's kind of the most curved, the very most curved part of the Bight. And so when you think about our coastline, we are quite far away from the edge of the continental shelf. And between the edge of the coast there in yellow and the continental shelf, it is a pretty shallow slope all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf below the ocean. Because of the shallowness, we have very low wave energy. So we have generally pretty low waves, And we also, because of the curved part of the coastline, we have a very high tidal range, especially when you think about how we compare to other areas of the East Coast. So we have low wave energy, we have high tidal range, and that is really the driver for what shapes our barrier islands. That's why they're nice and wide if you think about how our islands look compared to the islands along the North Carolina coast north of Hatteras. So that's one really important thing to think about. And then the other thing that makes the Georgia Bight so important for shorebirds is actually the inlets, the areas where water is flowing from the interior part of the country down out into the ocean. And so you can see this dark line here shows you the number of inlets. As we get towards the middle part of the Bight where we are, we have a lot of inlets, a lot of areas where water is coming out, just like you'll have with Broad River coming out to Port Royal Sound. And then those inlets are actually spaced really close together. So that means we've got lots of sand and sediments coming and flowing out, which helps build up the barrier islands and the sandbars and the mud flats that the birds are using. But it also brings lots of nutrients down, so it's a really nutrient-rich place, and those nutrients fuel all of the invertebrates that feed all of the shorebirds. And so generally speaking, when you think about the Georgia Bight, it is an unparalleled landscape. A lot of the folks that I work with have really traveled across the whole Western Hemisphere looking at shorebird habitat. And Brad Wynn particularly has been kind of all over the place, and he comes back every single time to the fact that the Georgia Bight is completely unparalleled and a hugely incredible place for shorebirds. And we've got these extensive remote beaches. We have this high tidal range that creates these huge expansive mud and sand flats that hold all of the invertebrates that fuel all of these shorebirds throughout the year. All these estuaries bringing down nutrients. And then the other thing that makes this area of the world so important is that we really have, when you think about the Georgia Bight, pretty minimal amount of shoreline engineering, very few modified inlets and hardened areas. And so that means all of that sand, those dynamic processes can continue. And so our islands build and shift and change, all creating really important habitat. We have a lot of areas with limited disturbance for birds to go. And then for shorebirds, there's actually a great opportunity for them to use impoundments and managed wetlands, which is a big part of the landscape in South Carolina, but also in Georgia as well. And so we are really lucky because we are a habitat of hemispheric importance throughout the entire year. You know, many places are important for shorebirds, maybe just during migration or just during the winter or just during nesting. We get the whole package. We have birds using the Georgia Bight in spring and fall migration, in the winter with birds like piping plovers that use our beaches as habitat, and then throughout the nesting season as well. So the Georgia Bight is important throughout the entire year. And that's significant, and it means we've got some additional challenges with management and protecting that habitat, but it also means we've got opportunity to interact with these birds really at any time of the year. So now I'm going to bring it back home to what we get to see on the beaches in the summertime. And so there are several species of shorebirds that nest on our beaches, but probably two of the most well-known focal species are American oyster catchers on the left and Wilson's plovers on the right. And so I had an opportunity for my PhD research to focus on these two species and really dig deep into understanding how they use beaches and how they use the habitat, and what makes a bird's nest successful versus what might make it more likely to fail. And so both oyster catchers and Wilson's plovers nest right out on the ground. Their eggs are very cryptic. They dig a little tiny depression called a scrape in the sand, and they lay their eggs right out on the sand. And then they have adorable, fuzzy little precocial chicks that you can see there on the right with two little chicks and an egg. And then in the background, the female Wilson's plover. And so, you know, I think this story of nesting on the beach highlights why shorebirds are so incredible. It is a pretty tough thing to spend all day, every day out on the beach in the Southeast in the summertime, right? I know a lot of us try to take refuge elsewhere, but not Wilson's plovers and oyster catchers. They commit, and so they, both the males and the females, work really hard throughout the summer to protect their eggs and their chicks. And so this is a female Wilson's plover, and she's incubating her eggs, and that actually means she's keeping them cool rather than keeping them warm. So she's keeping them shaded from the sun and protected so that they don't overheat. Also, I don't know if this works for y'all. It may be very choppy, but Wilson's plovers actively defend the nests against predators, and this is a behavior called broken wing display. And so they're feigning injury, they're pretending that they're hurt to lead the predator or the annoying biologist away from the nest so that those eggs are kept safe. And it takes about 25 to 28 days before the eggs hatch, so that's an extremely vulnerable time when they're at risk to predation or tidal overwash. They hatch and they have precocial chicks, so they're cute little fuzzballs, kind of peanut-sized, running around on toothpicks all over the beach. Hopefully y'all have gotten to see little Wilson's plover chicks running on the beaches, but they're very vulnerable at this stage as well because, of course, they're flightless. However, they can hide really well. For my research, I banded them and tracked them throughout that pre-fledging period. Trying to keep track of these little fluff balls on the beach is no small task, and so everybody gets its own unique color combination, and that allows us to track them and try to estimate survival and understand better how we can manage beaches for their success. They really are built for running. So sometimes within 15 minutes of hatching, they're fluffy and they're ready to go. They leave that nest site with their parents and move around on the beach, feeding on insects at first, and then eventually fiddler crabs, sometimes down at the tide line, sometimes on the back part of the beach, hiding really well. And eventually, after about 30 to 40 days or so, they reach the point where they're fledged and they can fly and they're safe. So the whole process is just full of risk, and the fact that they're even able to successfully produce any chicks at all, I think is a pretty incredible feat. But of course, shorebirds are not just nesting on our hot beaches here in the Southeast, they are also nesting up in the Arctic, and this is equally incredible. And so I spent the summer of 2014 up in Barrow, which is now called Upavik, I think, and got to witness the Arctic nesting season for shorebirds. And for me, this was the chance of a lifetime because I'd spent so long here in the Southeast seeing these birds getting all ready for their Arctic migration, spring with the red knots getting red and the dunlin getting their little black bellies. And when we get to see them at this stage, it's really only half the coin. It's like they lead a double life, right? These birds, when we see them, if you think of a spring flock of shorebirds, all they care about is two things, right? Eating and resting. That's it. That's their only goal. But when you get to see them in the Arctic, it's like the other side of the coin. It's a whole different bird. They're up there, they're singing, they're finding territories, they have flight, breeding flights, display flights, and songs actually, which is incredible to think of. A dunlin, it has like a little song that sounds like a UFO. It hovers up above the tundra on the Arctic with this fuzzy little song looking for a mate. So they leave our nice, warm, perfect beaches in May, right when the weather is at its peak and we're loving being in the Southeast. They take off and they go up to the Arctic that's covered in snow. And suddenly everything changes. They're worried about finding a territory and a mate and laying eggs and raising chicks in a super compressed window. They have to basically wait until the snow melts, and then they have to get on all of those tasks in order to successfully raise chicks, which is one of the reasons that it's so important for them to have places like the Southeast to prepare for that really short, super intense breeding season. And for me, this was just so eye-opening to get to see the other side of what these shorebirds go through. You see a bird like a ruddy turnstone, and for me, they're one of the prettiest. They stand out like a sore thumb. They're so bright and their plumage is so variable, and I'd always see them on the Georgia beaches, and I'd wonder, why in the world do you look like this? You're all decked out, and you don't blend in, and you don't really fit in here, but you see them up in the Arctic, and they blend in perfectly. And it really helps you understand when we get to see these birds in May, they are dressed for the Arctic breeding season, which is pretty incredible. And just to understand kind of the dual landscapes that they know about and that they're able to utilize. This is a video of an American golden plover that one of my colleagues shot with a little GoPro right by its nest. But you just see, if you imagine a shorebird that's so well equipped to handle our beaches in the Southeast, and then they go up and they understand this completely different landscape covered in lichens and tiny little willow trees and mosses and just open expanses of tundra. It's pretty awe-inspiring and pretty incredible. And then the chicks, of course, for Arctic nesting birds are ridiculously cute. I thought nothing could be cuter than a Wilson's plover chick. And then I got to go see these Arctic chicks, and they are so densely covered in fuzz, it may snow while there's still little peanuts running around on the tundra. And just like our shorebird chicks here in the southeast, they are up and moving really quickly, pretty much as soon as they hatch. And again, I'm sorry if this is pretty choppy for you guys getting to see it, but it's a phalarope, and that's actually the male, and he's got 4 little chicks, and so the females lay eggs, and then they take off and go find another male, and the male incubates those eggs and raises those chicks. And if you can see in this video, there's mosquitoes the size of my thumb flying around, and so it gives you a little bit of an indication. Everything's super compressed in the Arctic, so when the insects hatch out, there are a ton of insects, and that's what grows baby shorebirds, is insects up in the Arctic. But a really incredible and dramatic landscape. And so, of course, when we're thinking about shorebirds, we can't really talk about shorebirds without talking about migration. And the most incredible feat, of course, is this huge movement of birds, generally moving south to north in the spring and north to south in the fall. And of course, we're on the Atlantic Flyway, which is this green wedge right here. So pretty much the birds that we see tend to stick to the east coast of the US and South America, and up into Canada, of course. And so this is sort of the very typical route that many of our migrating shorebirds will take. And one of the most well-known migrating shorebirds is, of course, the red knot, which I know y'all are very familiar with red knots. But it is just worth mentioning, you know, we get red knots that winter here, but then we get these long distance migrants that come through in the spring as well. And when we're talking about champions of migration, we're seeing birds that come all the way from the very southern south part of South America and Tierra del Fuego, flying up 4,000 miles to Brazil, feeding there for a little bit, then flying another 3,500 miles to the southeast, feeding here for a little bit, and then flying all the way up into the Arctic where they're nesting. And for a long time, the consensus was that all birds had to go up to Delaware Bay, which is one of the huge staging stopover places for red knots and other Arctic nesting shorebirds. They go to Delaware Bay because there's a gigantic horseshoe crab spawn, and those horseshoe crab eggs fuel that migration. But recent research out of South Carolina with birds that have been carrying transmitters has shown that, that we have nearly a third of our birds actually bypass Delaware completely, and they just fly straight up to the Arctic. So they're able to fuel themselves on horseshoe crab eggs here in the southeast, but they also supplement it with those little coquina clams, Donax clams, as well at different tidal cycles. And they're able to find enough food and nutrients here in the southeast to fly that huge journey all the way up to the Arctic. And I think it's always worth imagining this bird the size of a robin flying these huge stretches, days on end, and they flap their wings the whole entire time. They're not just soaring like a vulture, right? It is a tremendous amount of work and a pretty big risk to go all the way up to the Arctic, but this is what they do every year, spring heading north, and then coming back south in the fall. And as they migrate, the most important thing during that journey is having safe places to stop, which I know y'all are very familiar with this. And so having these key stopover places with good food, but also safe places to rest is critically important. And when they have these good, safe places, they exhibit what we call site fidelity. And so that's every single time on this journey, they stop at pretty much the same exact place. And one of the birds that really highlighted this dependence on these places and this site fidelity is the very famous red knot B95, who was banded in South America and then resighted in Delaware Bay for nearly 20 years on that spring and fall migration. And so over the course of that time frame, that bird logged enough miles to travel the distance of the moon and nearly back again. And so having birds with bands that we can identify these individuals really helps highlight not only the tremendous feats that they're able to do, but highlights the importance of these key places. And we know that many of these long distance migrants are exhibiting some pretty significant population declines. The Rufa red knot, the red knot that we get here on the East Coast, is federally listed as threatened because of population declines. And so I wanted to toss in just a little bit. These are two birds that I got to see this spring at Fort Pulaski, where I've been doing surveys for a project that looks at disturbance and how people and birds use the beaches together. One of them, this black-bellied plover you see here, I saw that banded bird this spring, and it had actually been resighted in September 2019 by Diana Churchill, who y'all may know. And she got some pictures and saw it in September, and then I saw it in the spring. So I'm not sure if it stayed in our region the whole entire winter, or if it left and we saw it on both the fall and the spring migration. But this bird nests all the way up, if you can see that red star, in an area called Polar Bear Pass, all the way up in Arctic Canada. And so I reached out to colleagues in Canada at Environment Canada, and Paul Woodard said, oh, I know that bird, I'm the one that banded it. And he sent me pictures of its nest in the Arctic, this picture that he's holding the bird right when he banded it all the way up in the Arctic. So that is pretty incredible. And I think he said that he had banded that bird in 2018. And then this spring as well, y'all may not be able to see this picture depending on how your screen is configured, but there's a very bad picture of a red knot with an orange flag on its leg there. And I took that picture and realized that that bird was from Argentina with the orange flag on it, and got in touch. Actually, I had kind of forgotten about this observation, and the other night I got in touch with Patricia, because she bands all of these red knots down in South America, and she said, oh, of course I know that bird. That bird we banded in 2017 in San Antonio Oeste. And when we caught it, she said it had a very long bill, so probably a female. And she also remembered that it was extremely chubby. And interestingly, I saw it at the very end of spring migration, after most of the red knots had already left. You see, there's not really a lot of other red knots in this picture, so it was mostly semi-palmated sandpipers and ruddy turnstones in the flock, and one lone chubby red knot. And so she's the girl that Patricia banded several years earlier, and pretty incredible. So to me, it's just one of these things that, you know, shorebirds can connect us really across the whole entire hemisphere, especially during such a crazy time with this pandemic, where everything feels like we're all at odds. Getting to chat with Patricia and say, oh, sending hugs with red knots, and she said sending hugs with red knots back, and it's just a really incredible way to connect with people from across the entire globe. And so we'll wrap up here with thinking about the connections that whimbrels can create. And so this is, I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix this so I can see what I'm talking about. This is just one more story about how shorebirds are so incredible. And this is about a whimbrel named Pastel that was caught and banded and outfitted with a transmitter on St. Simons. But I like Pastel. Well, you'll see, I'm not going to spoil the end. So the story of whimbrels in the Southeast is a really incredible one, and we're learning more and more about it with new research that's going on here at Manomet and with South Carolina DNR as well. One of the things that we know is during the spring, we get huge numbers of whimbrel that are using the Southeast. And what we see is this pattern where they move every night to remote places to roost. And then at dawn, leave those roost sites and spread out all across the huge expansive marshes that we have in the Southeast to feed on fiddler crabs. And so you can see just an aerial image gives you just a little bit of a glimpse. This dark band here is all salt marsh. And so they have tons, ample feeding opportunities, tons of fiddler crabs that they're able to use, and they'll nearly double their body weight while they're here eating fiddler crabs. And if you have spent any time in the marsh, you know this is basically like an unlimited food resource. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the whimbrels. So they gorge on fiddler crabs, and every night they go out to these roosts. And recognizing the importance of this landscape for whimbrels, of course, leads to a lot of questions about who these birds are, where they're going, and what we can do to make sure that we can protect these habitats for whimbrels. So in 2012, Brad Wynn when he was still working for Georgia DNR down here on the coast before he left and went to Manomet, decided to embark on this project where he's going to outfit some whimbrels with transmitters. You can see he's holding a whimbrel there that's got a little antenna coming off its back. So they, Tim Keyes, who works for Georgia DNR, and Brad stalked these birds, and eventually they caught one, and they caught a male whimbrel on St. Simon's Island. If anybody's gotten to come down here to St. Simon's, it's a big marsh right in the middle of the island. Outfitted him with a little backpack and then let him go. Here's Tim letting him go. And so Postel stayed in Georgia for a few days and then left and flew nonstop for 2,000 miles north. And he went up to Hudson Bay to his breeding grounds. And he stayed there just for the breeding season, out on the tundra, nesting. And then, with his transmitter still pinging away to the satellites, left and headed south. And it took him, just a few days flying south, went to Virginia, but then eventually settled down in South Carolina, right in Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. And so one of the things that we know, and this is super interesting, is that for whimbrels on the southbound migration, here in Georgia, we hardly see any whimbrels. In the spring, we see tons of them, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of whimbrel all over the marshes and out on these roost sites. But in the fall in Georgia, we really don't get any. And South Carolina gets some. It gets a fraction of the numbers that we get in the spring. But interestingly, we really don't see nearly the number of whimbrel here in Georgia that y'all see in South Carolina. So anyways, Postel hangs out in South Carolina at Cape Romaine, feeding and building up strength, and then that's it. He takes a hop out over the open water and flies 3,400 miles nonstop down to the coast of Brazil. And the landscape that he's using in Brazil is actually mangrove forest. So again, this is another thing that I think is so incredible. This is a bird that knows how to use the salt marshes of Georgia, knows how to survive on the tundra up in the Arctic, comes down, visits Cape Romaine, and then flies down and he's feeding on crabs in the mangroves of Brazil. So just trying to wrap your mind around the vast amount of knowledge that these birds hold in terms of using resources really across the whole entire hemisphere. So Postel hangs out there in Brazil for about 7 months, and then he starts heading north again. And of course, he flies right back to the coast of Georgia. And so Fletcher Smith, who maybe y'all know, he does a lot of great work. He's down here in Georgia now, and he's working on red knots, amongst other things. He was out on the coast, and he actually saw a group of whimbrels, took a picture, and he got a picture of Postel. You can see him hanging out there with his buddies with his antenna sticking off the back. And so Postel transmitted for about 1,300 days, sending a signal along this journey. And what we saw when we looked at that, after 3.5 years of transmitting, that Postel's using these same sites, going north and coming back south every single time, stopping in very much the same exact places. And many of these places are protected for shorebirds, like the Georgia Barrier Islands, like Cape Romaine, all part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. But this is super cool because to us, it really helps highlight the importance of protecting each little link in this tremendous journey that these shorebirds are doing. You know, if one of these links is missing, or if the habitat changes dramatically, Postel's not going to be able to find what he needs to survive and continue on that migration. And so, of course, what we're seeing broadly when we think about shorebirds is, like many of the bird species that we all love, we are seeing some pretty significant population declines. And many of those declines are coming from the long distance migrants, birds like red knots and ruddy turnstones, birds that require these vast networks of places to find the resources that they need. And so you can see from about 1970, nearly a 40% decline of all shorebird species. This is from a report of the state of Canada's birds, but we're seeing, you know, these are North American birds and American birds too. So some pretty alarming population declines for shorebirds. And there's a couple of reasons that shorebird conservation is really challenging. First of all, these birds gather in really large groups at very specific places, right? We all know this. We love to go out and see a huge flock of red knots. And because of that site fidelity, if they lose any one of those places, it can affect the entire population. They cross huge geographic areas, so that means we have to have partnerships and people cooperating at a really large scale, working in concert in a way that people may not necessarily be very good at. And then finally, they depend on this very specific habitat. Coasts, if you think about them by their very nature, are limited, right? They're just a tiny ribbon between upland and water. And so these are areas that are really sought after for people as well. And so there's a lot of challenges with habitat conservation for shorebirds as well that can have implications for the entire population. So a lot of different issues like disturbance from recreational use of these places, habitat loss, climate change implications with sea level rise and increased storms, low reproductive success. But the great thing is that we've got a lot of tools at our disposal, you know, partnerships using education and outreach, research and management to help address some of these threats. And so I just wanted to end on a bit of a positive note with thinking about sort of the tools we have in our toolbox rather than ending on the gloom and doom of pretty significant population declines. First of all, one of the best tools in the toolbox is the International Shorebird Survey, which y'all have been awesome contributors to. This is outdated now. It has skyrocketed. We've got a lot more involvement in Central and South America. If you're not on the International Shorebird Survey email list, please get in touch with me and I could get you on that list, because now we have regular publications going out, newsletters with updates from all of the sites in North and South America that are participating in the International Shorebird Survey. And this data is really useful. It is being used in real time. And then there's also a very cool new feature that one of my colleagues, Lisa Shibley, has been working on relentlessly, and that is a mapping tool that allows you to actually see all the ISS sites in North and South America. She's got other data sets that have been added. You can search all different species, all different sites, time of year. You can filter it by all of these different parameters, and you can actually see tons of information pretty much in real time, results from International Shorebird Surveys, or at the very least, the raw data. So that is super cool, and that is a hugely important tool in the toolbox. You know, the Cornell paper that came out in the spring, the 3 billion bird paper, data like the International Shorebird Survey information went into making those population estimates. So that is a very important tool that we have at our disposal. The other is the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. So we've got 107 sites across the whole entire Western Hemisphere. And the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network is housed at Manomet. And so there's an executive office that oversees sites being accepted into the network. And it's driven by how many birds are using sites. So actual real data to highlight the importance of these places. Here in the Georgia Bight, we have 3 wizard sites. Down in Georgia, there's the Altamaha River site. The Georgia Barrier Islands are a landscape of hemispheric importance. And then of course, Cape Romaine Santee Delta region up in South Carolina. Really working to build the network beyond just the WISRN sites, hosting workshops and talking to partners and helping educate people about how the actions that they take at their site can influence shorebird populations broadly is a very important tool. And that includes working with farmers and, you know, in coastal areas and impoundments, all sorts of different places with a lot of different ways to address some of the challenges. Another important one is really building these collaborations and partnerships. I think the American Oystercatcher Working Group is a great example of that. And you can check out their website to learn more. But basically, this concerted effort to protect American oystercatchers has resulted in over 20% increase since this partnership formed in 2001 for a species that was really experiencing some pretty significant population decline. So that's a great example about how a concerted approach can really have some real direct on-the-ground impacts. That is kind of what Manomet is really all about, is building partnerships in order to have local actions connect more broadly to make these sorts of impacts across a wide geography. And so we do work with the Arctic Shorebird programs. We do help guide the American Oystercatcher Working Group through oystercatcher recovery, a really large in-depth program that focuses on shorebird recovery across the whole hemisphere. So you get to work with folks really from one end of the globe to the other. And the project that I'm working on specifically is focused, again, just on the Georgia Bight. And so, you know, with the recognition that there are a lot of partners and people that have been focused on shorebird conservation for a number of years. But the birds don't see sort of island boundaries or state boundaries or agency boundaries, right? So in order to have the impacts that we need to have to protect this important part of the world for shorebirds, we need to really collaborate and build capacity across borders. And so that's really what the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative is all about. It's helping to build these networks, address threats, maintain habitat, and then think creatively about how we can work in the future to help make sure that these places are well protected for shorebirds. Because we know that anything we do here has implications across the whole flyway, right? The whole Atlantic Flyway, birds are using this place and connecting us very broadly across this huge geography. So working together to sort of unite all of these different places and people is the goal of this project, to make sure that we're able to protect these places that shorebirds need. And this is just the general rundown of how you can help shorebirds, but I'm sure that everyone on the Zoom call already knows all of these things. So instead, I always try to just say, you know, we're the lucky ones that understand how incredible it is to share our beaches and our coasts with these shorebirds. And so what we can do, all of us, is share these stories with anybody that we encounter. You know, you don't have to be able to tell which sandpiper is which. You don't have to be an expert in all of the intricate details of these stories, but helping somebody understand that the bird that's resting on the beach may have just flown thousands of miles and that they should walk around those birds, or helping understand that a dog off the leash looks really scary to a shorebird, even if it's a golden retriever that just loves tennis balls. Helping bridge that gap between people that may not even know what a shorebird is can be really impactful and can help make sure that each little patch that we're loving stays safe for shorebirds. If you're interested in being involved with any of the citizen science, I know you guys have an awesome network, and I'm so excited that I finally got to see some of y'all that participate in ISS. But if there's anything that we can do to help facilitate any of that, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Becoming a voice for shorebirds is also really important. Helping fund any of these initiatives that nonprofits are working on to protect places for shorebirds is also super impactful. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And if anybody wants any more information about the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative, I've got a lot of material that I'm happy to email or share with you more in depth at any point. And hopefully I didn't talk too long and we still have some time for some questions. I get a little excited and go long sometimes, but